Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. It is an honor to be with you today. As Cambria mentioned, I am a small church pastor and have been for over 40 years, but I didn't know I was a small church pastor for the first 25. See, I was convinced that I was a big church pastor that just hadn't gotten there yet. But any minute now, it was going to kick in, and for a whole lot of years, it just didn't kick in. So what we've done is we've started a ministry that we call Helping Small Churches Thrive, which does what the name implies. We try to help small churches be as good as they can be at the size they are right now. There are a whole bunch of materials up there about how to grow your church, so I figured I didn't need to duplicate any of that. So what we do is we help you be good and thrive and be solid and be effective at the size you are right now without aiming for numerical growth, because if that happens, there's a bunch of folks who can help you out with that. And in this session this morning, I want to talk to you about desizing the church. And it's based on a book that I actually wrote, my most recent book, entitled Desizing the Church. And I wrote the book because we have been going to conferences for years now, for over a decade, and we've spent so much time encouraging small church pastors. In fact, when we started the ministry, we had a threefold goal. First of all, we wanted to encourage small church pastors. Secondly, we wanted to find small church specific resources that might be different than what we get from our big church friends, because the difference between a big and small church is not just a matter of scale, it's actually a matter of type. And you have to lead differently in a small church than in a big church. And then our third goal was that we wanted to mainstream these ideas into the broader church world so that it wasn't just small church pastors in the corner having this different conversation, but so that everybody could really be invited into the value of the small church and resourcing and equipping it together. But as we've been doing this, quite often we'll go to a conference, and at the book table afterwards or in conversations in the lobby, we'll talk to small church pastors who feel like they've finally been heard. They've finally been recognized. They're finally leaving a conference feeling encouraged rather than discouraged. And this happens so many times that Shelley and I developed the phrase, we feel like we just pulled some more bodies out of the river. And a few years ago, as we were driving away from a conference and we had that expression, we just pulled a couple more bodies out of the river, I thought, okay, but I wonder if there's a way to go upriver and find out who's been tossing the bodies in. Because this obsession with size is not necessarily a natural thing. This came from somewhere. And this obsession with size that is discouraging so many pastors has got to have come from somewhere. And I want to state this really quickly. I am not about churches being small. I don't want churches to be small. I want small churches to be great. And I am not against big churches. Look where we are. I am constantly grateful for the extraordinary generosity of our big church friends. They do things like this week where they open up this massive, beautiful facility and their staff comes around and they give with great generosity. So I'm not about small over big. I'm about bringing small into the conversation more often than we often are brought into the conversation. That's all. So I wrote this book called Desizing the Church, and the subtitle is How Church Growth Became a Science, Then an Obsession, and What's Next. And it's really an exploration into how did we get here where we have this obsession with size. So that's what we're going to talk about this morning. For anybody who'd like to follow along a little more closely, this session and both of my workshops this afternoon, it'll be the same one twice, so you can go to another one. You can come to one of mine and go to somebody else's. All of it will be on this web page that I created just for this event, karlvaters.com/EFCA West 26. So you can scan that QR code, or you can just punch that URL into your search bar, and you can find all of the notes. Pretty much everything you'll see on the screen while I'm talking will be on this web page. So we're going to take a look at this concept of desizing the church. And it's an interesting thing. I discovered this. When you write a book, you get to make up words if you want to. So I had these ideas, and I didn't know what to call them, and I couldn't find a word that described what I wanted to, so I just made one up, desizing. And because it's on the cover of a book, it's a word now. So I made up a word, which is really interesting because that's how we got all the words. Somebody made them up, right? So I made up this word, which means I'm going to need to define it, which I will in a moment. But the first thing I want to do is we're going to take a look at these 5 questions. We're going to ask and answer these 5 questions for you this morning. What is desizing? Why do we need to desize? Where did our obsession with bigness come from? Again, being big is not a problem, but our obsession with having to get big is a problem. Where did this come from? Fourth, what are the dangers of pursuing bigness? And fifth, how do we fix this? So let's take a look at these one at a time. First of all, what is desizing? Here's how I define it in two different ways. First definition is this. It's the process of assessing the value of something without obsessing over numbers. Definition number two is this. In the church, it's choosing to evaluate the health and vitality of a congregation, a denomination, or a movement without using attendance figures, percentages, or numerical comparisons as the primary consideration. Now, so that you don't hear what I'm not saying, I want to point out the two key words, one from each of these definitions. In the first definition, the key word is obsessing, and in the second definition, the key word is primary. I'm not against numbers. I'm not against metrics. Metrics and numbers can show us things that we otherwise would not see. We need good and accurate numbers. But the obsession with numbers is causing some problems. And when we're using numbers as the primary consideration by which we consider a church or a ministry to be valid, then we're using the wrong metrics. Now, using numbers as part of the metrics, fine. But using bigger this year than last year as the only metric, which often happens, is causing all kinds of problems. So if it's causing problems, let's go to the next question. Why do we need to desize? What's going on here? All right? Numbers define us. They shouldn't, but they do. Especially in the church, numbers define us way more often than they should. Let's be honest about it. Pastor of a church of 3,000 is given more credibility than the pastor of a church of 300. That shouldn't be, and you may not even want to admit it to yourself, but we all know it's true. And they're given way more credibility than the pastor of a church of 30. Again, it shouldn't be, but this is the way we've perceived things. We have perceived people's value by the numbers that are attached to them. We've become obsessed with bigness at almost all costs. And it's cost us a lot. In fact, I'm convinced that one of the biggest reasons behind the high rate of pastoral departures and burnout is because of this relentless pursuit of size that doesn't always manifest for most churches. In fact, our obsession, not just with size, but with big numbers, may be the major but least acknowledged contributing factor in pastoral burnout, in church scandals, in divisiveness, in misallocation of resources, and a host of other church dysfunctions. Now, I'm not saying that our obsession with size is the main contributing factor, but I think it's the biggest unacknowledged one. If we could just simply take the burden off of pastors' shoulders of, I've got to get bigger next year, how much more peace and health would we bring to their emotions and to their spirits and to the church that they serve? Just to give you an idea of some of the cost of our numerical obsession. About 2 years ago, Matt Redman put out a video on YouTube called Let There Be Light. Matt Redman, of course, is well known for writing so many of the beautiful worship songs that we've been singing for over 30 years. And this video is not a music video. Matt Redman's video, Let There Be Light, is a 30-minute video approximately in which he makes the claim that in the 1990s, when he was coming up and becoming well known, the pastor who was overseeing the ministry he was working under was sexually and emotionally abusing him. Now, there's been nothing proven, so I'm not even going to name who that pastor is because, presumed innocent until proven guilty. But he makes that claim in the video because he says, I brought it to his authority and they haven't answered back on it. And in the video, they interview several people who knew about the situation. And over half a dozen times in a half-hour video, when they asked people, why didn't somebody do something about this at the time? Over half a dozen times, the answer was some version of, well, we knew there was a problem, but look at the numbers. Yeah, he was a little handsy, but look at all the kids coming to Jesus. The numerical success provided cover for sin. And we all know that's not the only place in which that has happened. We need to desize because our obsession with getting bigger is hurting us and it's hurting our witness. Getting bigger is not hurting us, but our obsession with it is problematic. So let's get to the question that began the book for me. Where did our obsession with bigness actually come from? Well, here's a picture that I'd like to draw for you of how I think we got here. And it's not going to sound like it makes sense at first, but stay with me, we'll get there. When I was a young man, graduated from high school and went to college, I went to Modesto Junior College. Anybody from the Modesto area? Yeah. I went to Modesto Junior College for 2 years before I went to Bible college. And in my second semester, I took an Economics 101 class. So it's a secular college Economics 101 class. I walk into the class, I sit down, and I'm old, so this was back in the day where he took out one of those plastic slides and put it on the overhead, remember that, the overhead projector? And he put up a whole bunch of words. Today we would call it a word cloud. And these are just some of the words that were on the screen that he put up in front of us. Family, community, loyalty, kindness, fairness, joy, love, fun. And he had all these, there were maybe 30, 40 words like that up on the screen. He said, I want you to read all these words because I want you to know that these are the most important things in your life. These are the things that you should value. I'm reading this and going, did I wander into the ethics class by mistake? I thought this was Economics 101. And he said, these are the things that matter, but this is Economics 101. So for the next 13 weeks, we are not going to talk about the things that actually matter in your life. Because this is Economics 101, for the next 13 weeks, we're going to talk about this like it's the only thing that matters in your life. We're going to talk about how to make money, how to invest your money, how money affects geo-global politics. We're going to talk about money as though it's the most important thing in your life, but I want you to remember that it's not. And then for the next 13 weeks, he was true to his word. He talked about money as if it was the most important thing in the world. And then we had the last class day. We took our final exams. We handed them in. And he said, before you head out for the summer, I want to remind you of what we've done this semester. He said, for 13 weeks, we've talked about money as if it's the only thing that matters. And he put this up on the slide again. But I want you to remind you, it is not the thing that matters in your life. This is what really matters in your life. These are the values that you should live under. Have a great summer. And he dismissed the class. And I noticed, even as a young man in college, there was a shift in the room from the first day of that class to the last day of the class. On the first day of the class, there was some curiosity as to why the economics professor was putting that up. But there was general agreement with, yeah, those are the most important things in our life. But by the last day of the class, after 13 weeks, I noticed a shift in the body language of about half the students at least. About half the students at least were looking at that and going, yeah, okay, you tell me that that's what's important, but I know how to make bank now. And what had happened is, in the 13 weeks that he had used and pretended that money was the most important thing in his life, in our lives, without intending to, he had begun to rewire the value systems of the students in that class. So what they saw on the screen was this, but what they saw in their lives was this. Money had taken over as a value in their lives. He had begun to rewire their value systems unintentionally by teaching for 13 weeks that money was the most important thing in the world. And he even told us it isn't. We're just going to act as though it is. So why am I telling you this story? Because as a pastor now for over 40 years, for the last 40 years, I've gone to conferences like this. And for a good 30 of those years, maybe even more, I've heard from church growth leaders who have gotten up and who have assumed that the people in the room understand that this is the most important thing in your church. That these are the values of your church. Sometimes they'll mention that and they'll talk about it, but sometimes they won't even mention it. They'll just assume it because today, while this is what matters in your church, today we're going to talk about this like it's what matters in your church. We're going to talk about how to get those numbers up. And I went through 25 or 30 years of conferences where this was almost all I heard at every single conference. And if 13 weeks can begin to rewire a bunch of value systems for a bunch of college kids, what has 40 years of this done in the church? I would propose that what it's done is this. That in many cases, we know that this is what matters, But we don't really talk about it as much as we should. I'm so grateful to Chris for what he talked about. And I'm telling you, as I was listening to it, I thought, people are going to think he and I coordinated our talks. Because he went deep into this. And I'm so grateful for that. And so many do. But so often, we assume this, but what we actually end up with is this. So there were years that I would go to a conference and we'd talk about Bible study as a means to church growth, integrity as a means to church growth, outreach as a means to church growth, worship as a means to church growth. That was actually a title of a workshop that I saw years ago, worship as a means to church growth. Let me tell you folks, worship is not a means to anything. Worship is the point. But when we make this shift, we devalue the things that we're supposed to value because we're trying to put the numbers forefront. And our obsession with size is rewiring our value systems to a point where it's dangerous. And you don't need to pay too much attention to the church news that's been going on in your feed, just like it's been going on in my feed for the last couple of years, to realize that big church doesn't necessarily mean integrity. Small church doesn't either. Small isn't better than big. Size has nothing to do with it. So this is a big part of where our obsession with bigness came from. But let's go a little bit deeper into that. So I'm trying to figure out, if I go upstream, where did this obsession with size come from? And I thought, well, I need to do an assessment of the church growth movement. And one of the first things I discovered was that there wasn't just one church growth movement, there were actually two church growth movements. The first church growth movement I call the McGavran stream. If you haven't heard the story, this will be good news for you, and if you have heard the story, this will be a good reminder. But Donald McGavran was a missionary to India from 1923 to 1954. Near the end of his time as a missionary in India, he heard about several villages in India where everybody in the village had come to faith in Christ. And he thought, yeah, that can't be. But he was a researcher, so he said, I'm going to go find out what's actually going on there. And he went to these villages, did interviews with people, and he discovered that, in fact, yes, there were entire villages where every single person in the village had come to faith in Christ. And he thought, God is doing something special here. I want to learn from it to see if we can maybe learn something from it that we can take home. And so he wrote down all of his findings. And then on his way home after retirement, he actually went to Africa, went to a couple African nations because he heard there were villages there where the same thing had happened, and he discovered it's the same thing here, and he wrote down his findings. And then he came home and took all of what he found in those situations, and in 1965, he wrote his first book called The Bridges of God. Now, The Bridges of God is universally understood to be the first book ever in church growth. In fact, it is the first place where the term church growth ever appears in print. 1955, The Bridges of God. 10 years later, in 1965, at 68 years of age, he started the Church Growth Institute at Fuller. For the first 7 years at the Church Growth Institute at Fuller, American pastors were not allowed to attend his classes on church growth. Now, you can't just say no American pastors allowed, that gets you in trouble. So he weeded out the American pastors by requiring every student to meet 3 qualifications. You couldn't take his church growth class unless you had a mastery of 2 languages, unless you had spent at least 2 years in a foreign field doing ministry, and until you submitted a paper showing that you had a strong understanding of an indigenous people group other than your own. And if you require that, you get rid of 99.9% of American pastors, including me on all 3 counts. So for 7 years, he pastored, and there were a couple American missionaries in it, but for the most part, there were no American pastors in his class for 7 years. But the American pastors were reading his stuff about church growth, and they wanted in the class. And so finally, in 1972, at age 75, he finally gave in to the overwhelming requests, and he taught the first ever church growth class at Fuller, along with C. Peter Wagner, one of his early students. And that class in 1972 is universally understood to be the spark point for the entire American church growth movement. So that's where the second one comes from. Let's take a look now at what this means. So I'm reading through his biography. I'm learning what I just told you. And I start to wonder, why didn't he want American pastors in his class? What was going on? And so I looked in the back of the book, and the author had put his email on the back of the book, so I thought he must not have put his email back in the back of the book if he didn't want someone contacting him. So I emailed Dr. Gary McIntosh at Biola. I said, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about McGavran. He said, I'd love to. So I've had a couple conversations with him, and I asked him, first of all, why didn't Donald McGavran want American pastors to attend his class? And he's the one who introduced me to the American stream. He said there's an American stream of church growth that he knew would be very different than his idea of church growth, and he didn't want to unite the two. I said, what is that, and why didn't he want to unite it? He said, well, Donald McGavran was not concerned with church size. Donald McGavran simply wanted to see people come to Christ. He wanted to increase the percentage of Christians in the community, and he didn't care how big the churches were. So he said, if multiplying healthy small venues is the best way to reach people for Christ, let's do that. If building a big church is the best way to reach people for Christ in another community, let's do that. Let's not obsess over churches getting bigger. Let's get completely focused on winning people to Christ by whatever is the best means necessary in that given context. Okay, so I said, again, why didn't he want American pastors to do that? Because he said, he knew the American mindset, and he knew that if American pastors got a hold of his ideas, we would individualize it and turn it into how to make my church get bigger. And that was never what he was about. And then what happened in 1972 when the class got taken? We did exactly what he feared. We turned it all into a big church contest. We did. And that's where we got to the point where the big church has more credibility than the small in far too many ways. So I'm looking at that, and I'm having this conversation with Dr. McIntosh, and then I think, what is it about the American psyche that makes us so obsessed with size? Because I've traveled a lot. In this ministry, the Lord has blessed us to be able to travel around the world. And in most places in the world, you don't find this obsession with size unless they've been affected by the American approach. In fact, everywhere I've gone, whenever they have got this obsession with size, they can always trace it back to an American teaching. So why does this come from America? And it's actually interesting. Our obsession with size in America actually comes as an unintended negative consequence of some of America's best ideas. And by our best ideas, I mean First Amendment. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, right? Freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, our best ideas. So the people who wrote those amendments had mostly been descendants of people who had come from Northern Europe. They had come from Northern Europe. We know the Thanksgiving story of the Pilgrims, at least in part for religious freedom, because in Northern Europe at the time, almost every single country had a state-sponsored church. And if you were a pastor of a state-sponsored church, you had a very easy life, because if the state sponsors the church, when the state collects taxes, the state also collects your tithes. And in those Northern European countries, most of them had a 100% tithing base from the entire population. So if you were pastoring a state-sponsored church, it didn't matter how many people showed up because the government's collecting the tithes for you and they're getting everybody. And so these grand cathedrals got built and all these other things on the back of a mandated tithing by the state church. So in America, we leave because of religious freedom in part. We get here and we go, we don't want state-sponsored churches, some of our best ideas, First Amendment. But if the state ain't paying for it, if the state ain't sponsoring it, the state ain't paying for it. So all of a sudden, you've got a bunch of people wanting to start churches, but where's the money going to come from? They've come out of a culture in which they didn't have to worry about funds because they got their government check every month. There's no government check coming in America. So what happened in America, real short, was this. The pastor who could attract the biggest crowd, gathered the biggest offering, was able to build the biggest buildings. And the idea of size being connected to success was born. And it's affected everything that we talk about today, and we don't even realize that we're swimming in that stream. So what we're doing is we're swimming in the American stream, even while we're using a lot of the McGavran language. But McGavran knew about the American stream, and he tried to resist it as long as he possibly could, until finally it just became too big, and it overwhelmed everything. So the villain I thought I was going to find turned out not to be the villain. McGavin wasn't tossing people into the river upstream. So that now we're answering this question. Let's go to the next question. Basically, so what? Okay, so Americans like things big. What's wrong with that? Right? I like things big too, right? Why is this a problem? What are the dangers of pursuing bigness? So in my book, I go through a bunch of different reasons, but for this morning and for our time together, I'm just going to give you two. Here are two of the dangers of pursuing bigness in the church. First of all, it gives us an overconfidence in our own abilities. And secondly, it causes us to have an oversimplification of our goals. If it's just about numbers, when we get the numbers, we become really overconfident in our ability to do that. And when it's just about numbers, we make our goals very simplified, and it's really not what God intended. So let's take a look at these one at a time. First of all, let's take a look at the danger of the overconfidence in our abilities. As I was researching the book, I discovered a phenomenon, and I went, oh my, this explains so much in so many different areas. Something called the Dunning-Kruger effect. I'm seeing some nods of people who know, you know where this is going already. Okay. The Dunning-Kruger effect. Take a look at this chart. The higher you go, the more confident you are. The further you go to the right, the more actual knowledge and experience you have. Now, this is better on a wide, but we've got a tall, so we're going to see if we can work this out on the tall screen here, okay? So the Dunning-Kruger effect describes how people learn complex subjects over a long period of time. And here's how it works. This is the path that we usually follow to learn complex things over a long period of time. We start down here knowing nothing and knowing that we know nothing. So we have no confidence because we don't know anything. And then we watch a YouTube video. Right? If you were pastoring during COVID, you had a bunch of them sent to you, people who knew how to pastor your church better than you did because they hadn't pastored a minute in their lives, but that YouTube guy had it figured out. And they were super confident about it. All right? This is also like first or second year after Bible college for a whole lot of us. We come out of Bible college and, dude, I got this sucker figured out. Nobody's ever been able to do youth or worship or pastor like me. I've got it figured out. All right? We come out with all this confidence and quite often arrogance. Some people have called this Mount Stupid. I would never call it that, but we come out and we've got this peak of overconfidence. But here's the thing. If you continue to actually learn and grow and move along the scale from left to right, what happens fairly quickly is you begin to discover, oh man, this is harder than I thought it was. Oh, I thought I had it figured out, but I really don't. And you drop fairly quickly down into what I call the valley of underconfidence. Oh man, this pastoring thing is harder than I thought. It's way more complex. People are weird. They just don't get along with the program, right? And you end up in this place where you're wondering, and here's what I've discovered. I'm convinced that a whole bunch of good people who have been called into ministry leave ministry here because they think that this means they weren't called. And if they could only understand that this is part of the necessary process, that they would maybe stick with it. And here's the thing, the higher your overconfidence, the lower your underconfidence goes. If we can start out with a little more humility, we won't have quite the dip. All right? In fact, here's an idea of how that's actually worked out. This is a screenshot from a small church pastor's Facebook group in which a small church pastor said this: I've just hit my 4th year of pastoring. I'm really considering resigning. I'm not even certain if I've been called to be a lead pastor. It's a struggle. My heart is broken. That does not surprise me that that's year 4. Year 1 or 2, woohoo, we're going to do it, man. Year 4, wow, this is really, really hard. And if people could know that there's something else that happens next if you stick with it, I think more of us would stick with it. Because if you stick with it, here's what happens. If you continue to gain knowledge and experience, you go up what I call the slope of experience. And the magic of the slope of experience is this: your knowledge and your confidence increase at the same rate. And that's sustainable. And then after you go up the slope of experience, you get to arrive at what I call the plateau of sustainability. Now, the plateau doesn't mean you stop learning because it continues to go off here. You continue to learn, you continue to have experience, but you'll never be as smart as you were back here. Because of something that I call the gap of humility. Right? If you stick with it long enough, experience will beat some humility into all of us. And so in pastoral ministry, I've been at this long enough, I'm at the plateau of sustainability. I've got a lot to learn, and I know it. Because real world pastoral experience has beaten some humility into me. But here's the deal. Whether you're on the slope of experience or at the plateau of sustainability, there's going to be somebody in your church who's here who thinks you're an idiot. Simply because they mistake humility for lack of confidence. And humility is not lack of confidence. Humility is experience. This is how we learn complicated subjects over a long period of time. Now, what does this have to do with desizing the church, with our obsession with size and so on? Well, for the 1980s and 1990s especially, and with a little bit of bleed over on each side of that, the church in America was at the peak of overconfidence. We had figured a few things out, and we went to conferences where big churches had been built, and we thought, I'm going to go home and do that too. And we were at the peak of overconfidence. In fact, I did the demographic study of it. The 1980s and 1990s were demographically the highest attendance and the highest church membership in American history. See, we've got this weird picture in our head that it was so godly back here and it's just gone downhill for the last 250 years. Nonsense. They didn't call it the Wild West because of all the churches. We didn't need 2 great awakenings because everything was awesome. Right? In fact, in 1776, church attendance was at 17%. Because for the first time, they weren't required to like they were in Europe, and they went, then we ain't gonna. And that's why we needed 2 great awakenings, because America was an ungodly place for a long period of time. And it's gone up and down and up and down. But the peak demographically is within our lifetimes. So we were at the peak of overconfidence. We've got all this church growth material. It's working. Look at all the people attending. Woohoo! We've got it figured out. Anybody think the church in America is on the peak of overconfidence anymore? Where do you think we are? Feels way more like this, doesn't it? What is going on? What are we missing? What is happening? What do we need to change? How do we need to rethink this? It's a challenging time right now. Here's a way of illustrating this. During the peak of overconfidence, these were the books that were on almost every pastor's shelf. Your church can grow, purpose-driven church, user-friendly churches, your church has real possibilities, how to break growth barriers, simple church, natural church development. That is an optimistic set of titles. Now, I'm having fun with it, but I'm not making fun of them. I read all of them, and I got great things out of them. But it was gung-ho, man, we can do this. Like, it's natural, it's user-friendly, it's simple. Like, what was one of the statements was, all healthy things grow. The assumption was, if you're healthy, growth will be automatic, because look around and look at all the people we can point to where that seems to be true. Right? That was during the peak of overconfidence. Nobody writes any books during the valley of underconfidence. Just eat too much ice cream. But now I believe we're coming out of the valley of underconfidence and beginning to come up the slope of experience. And under the slope of experience, this is the kind of books that pastors are reading today. The Great Evangelical Recession, The Great Dechurching, The Rise of the Nuns, Losing Our Religion, Autopsy of a Deceased Church, Unchristian. And that's what my book tries to approach too, Desizing the Church. So if these are optimistic, these aren't pessimistic, I believe these are more realistic. Now, this isn't unrealistic. These were written during a very optimistic time where a lot of stuff seemed to really be working. But everybody's reassessing it now, and for good reason, because we're not on that peak of overconfidence anymore. We are now at this other place. We're on the valley of underconfidence, and how do we get out of that up to the slope of experience? And we've got to start rethinking a whole lot of this. And so we need to take a real blinders-off, realistic approach to both the good and the bad so that we can start going up the slope of experience. Here's my hope. We've had 30 years or so on top of the peak of overconfidence. What if we spent the next 30 years going up the slope of experience where we had a little more humility in our approach to what God is doing in our churches? Instead of figuring out that we've got all the answers. And if we can set aside, I've got to get bigger next month, or that bigger automatically means success, and not make it quite so simplistic, then maybe we can actually have a little more humility as we go along. Speaking of being simplistic, here's another problem that we have with pursuing bigness. It does cause us to oversimplify our goals. How many times have you been at a conference where the only speakers sometimes on stage are the person who took the church from 30 to 3,000 in 3 years? Because here's the way we've looked at church growth and health for over 30 years. We have looked at churches and they're either small and assumed to be unhealthy, or they're big and presumed to be healthy. We've just presumed it, right? Big, they must be doing something right. Small, we use terms like stuck and broken. It's just assumed. In fact, there was a headline 2 or 3 years ago by a major Christian ministry, very good ministry that does very good work. And they did a survey of American churches, and the headline that came out was 2/3 of American churches are stuck or declining. I thought, I know things are bad, but I didn't think it was quite that bad. So I did something really weird. I read more than the headline. And in paragraph 2, doesn't take long, folks. In paragraph 2, they gave the breakdown. And the breakdown was this: 1/3 of American churches are decreasing in number, 1/3 of American churches are staying the same size, and 1/3 of American churches are increasing in number. The headline from that was 2/3 of American churches are stuck or declining. But if we can look at this and say, maybe there's other factors at play, even if we still just stick with the numbers, why wasn't the headline 2/3 of American churches are holding their own or increasing? That's just as true a headline. But we are so obsessed with having to get bigger, if your church hasn't gotten bigger, we assume something's wrong. And that is not necessarily the case. In fact, it's not the case in most of the healthy small churches that I've gone to. There are a lot of churches that don't change in size year after year. Some of them because, hey, we're in Orange County here. The church I serve in Fountain Valley, we have a 25% turnover every year. We got a lot of college students. So we've got to grow by 25% just to maintain. And we're a sending church. We got people from our church who were raised up in our church who are serving all around the country and around the world. So are we stuck? Are we unhealthy because we're not increasing in number? No, we're contributing to the growth of the kingdom of God in ways that are outside of our walls. Other churches grow big inside the walls, and the walls have to get bigger. Some churches are sending churches, and God uses them at the size they are right now in some wonderful and healthy and effective ways. But this doesn't allow for that to take place. It's overly simplistic. So here's what I suggest. Instead of looking at this one-dimensionally, any math majors in the room, right? This is a line, right, is a one-dimensional image. Let's break it out into just 2 dimensions. If you break it out into just 2 dimensions, you allow for more realities to take place. You still have small and unhealthy churches. Of course you do. You still have big and healthy churches. Of course you do. But now you allow for the idea that there are some big and unhealthy churches. Right? Recent headlines have proven there's a bunch of big churches out there that are built on sand. There's some real challenges out there. Of course there are some big and unhealthy churches, but there are also some small and healthy churches. This allows us to see a different reality. And when we break it out into two dimensions instead of one, take a look at what we learn, a way we now approach learning and growing as pastors and as churches. We have assumed that the information flow should always go from the top down, from big to small. But if you break it out into 2, you realize, no, the information should always flow from right to left, from healthy to unhealthy. Just by acknowledging that there are 4 realities and not 2. By not conflating size with health. We've got to do that, but we haven't. We've oversimplified these things, and so we need to have this expanded view of size and health. So that brings us to the next question, which is, so how do we fix this? How do we fix this? Now, before I get to that, and conclude with this in this last 10 minutes, just to give you some idea for the workshops and so on. For those of you who may be interested in coming to my workshop, I'll be doing the same thing twice, so you can come to one of mine. You can go to the other great workshops that are being offered. But in my breakout, I'm going to be talking specifically to those of you who serve in small churches. So if you serve in a small church and you want to hear more about the ministry in small churches and how it matters, we're going to talk about 3 ways a small church can be an effective church. We're going to talk about that in my workshop, and you can talk to us back at the book table about that and pick up any of those books that will help you with small church resources. But now let's get to this. How do we fix this? First of all, we need to begin to talk about church health non-numerically. Think about it. When you come to an event like this, at some point somebody will ask you, or maybe has already asked you, so how's your church doing? And you're going to have a number that you're going to want to say. I'm going to encourage you to change the conversation. And here's how. The next time before you come to a meeting like this, you know you're going to be asked that question. So before you come, I want you to pause, and I want you to think back over the last few weeks or months in your church, and I want you to remember 1 or 2 stories of life transformation that happened as a result of the ministry of your church. And then when somebody asks you, how's your church doing? I want you to answer them this way. Let me tell you about so-and-so who came to Jesus and was baptized 3 weeks ago. Let me tell you about this couple that was on the verge of divorce, but our divorce care recovery workshop came into their lives, and our church has gathered around them and loved on them, and their marriage has been restored. This is the kind of work that God is doing in our congregation. The only way we're going to change the conversation from numbers to stories is if we do it. And it won't happen if you don't think about it in advance. We're so numbers oriented. If you're not prepared for it in advance, when somebody asks you, how's your church doing, a number is going to be the first thing that pops into your head. And let's face it, you're going to pad that number by at least 20% higher. Right? Because when anybody gives me a number, I always drop it by 20% because it'll get me a more realistic place. We all do it, don't we? We need to start to talk about church health non-numerically. The conversation won't change unless we change it. And then when the book takes a turn, at the end of the book, the last third of Desizing the Church, I make a turn to the place of where we are right now. How do we fix this? And there are 2 chapter titles that happen right at the beginning of that place where we make a turn. And I'm going to base my last 2 points off of those 2 chapter titles. First chapter title is this: Discipleship Fixes Everything. One of the things I love about writing a book is if you write something stupid, unless you hit publish, nobody knows you wrote something stupid. So I wrote that down and I looked at it and went, I don't know if that's one of the best things I've ever written or one of the stupidest things I've ever written. So I'm going to sit on this for a couple days and ponder it and pray on it. And as I thought about it for the next couple of days, I started to think, is there any problem in the church that the discipleship won't fix? And I couldn't think of one. Think about it. Is there a problem in your church that discipleship won't fix? Lack of volunteers? Discipleship will fix that. Lack of money? Discipleship will fix that. Disunity? Discipleship will fix that. Bad theology? Discipleship will fix that. It's almost like this is what Jesus told us to do. Discipleship literally fixes everything. But we know this. It was on the word cloud. But when we start talking and when we continue to obsess about numbers and getting the numbers up, quite often getting the numbers up supersedes the thing we were called to do with discipleship. I've got this conversation in my head from the Bible. It didn't happen in the Bible. It just happens in Karl's head. But in Karl's head, this is what happened. Jesus was about to ascend into heaven. He's on the mountain about to descend into heaven. And he says, okay, I'm about to leave. I'm going to come back, but I'm not going to tell you when because I don't know when. But I'm going to come back at some point. But in the meantime, let's gather together. I want to remind you, here's the cliff notes on what I've taught you. You ready? I will build my church. You go make disciples. And the disciples respond with, got it, Jesus. We'll go build your church. No. I will build my church. Okay. You go make disciples. Oh, got it. We'll go build your church. No! And we've been having this argument with Jesus for 2,000 years. Stop trying to build the church. It's Jesus' job. He's better at it than you. Stop. Do what Jesus called us to do. Discipleship. Discipleship fixes everything. In fact, one of the things we're doing right now, it's a new kind of approach in our ministry, is we're doing online webinars. The one that's coming up is based on my book, 100 Days to a Healthier Church. Let me ask you this question. What would you do to get your church healthier in 100 days? Not bigger, but healthier. How much would you commit? What would you do? How heavy would you press if your church could be healthier in 100 days? That's the premise behind the book and behind the webinar that we're going to be doing. So you can scan that. If you can't catch it from where you are, you can scan the QR code at our table. From May 5th to June 16th, every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Pacific, we're going to have that. And in fact, the pricing on that is wrong. We're going to get it to you for $149. We're going to give you the way to do that by putting in-person into the access code. So if you scan that back of the book table, we'll walk you through how to do that. And you'll also today get this wall chart, which is a 3x5 calendar that walks you through the entire process. Your church can become healthier in 100 days. This is about discipleship and not about numerical increase. Does discipleship sometimes cause numerical increase? Yes. But I can tell you from a church that has not grown numerically significantly over the last 10 to 15 years, we do a lot of discipleship and we send a lot of people off into ministry, and it doesn't necessarily mean more butts in the seats in front of me on a Sunday morning. But is the impact on the kingdom of God bigger? Yes. That was McGavran's idea. We do ministry from the church, not just inside the church. And then the second way we're going to talk about how do we fix this, and it's the next chapter title, and it's the last piece we'll look at this morning, is this. Integrity is the new competence. For 40 years, I've gone to church growth conferences, and I've heard from people who have assumed that they were talking to people of integrity. And I want to make that assumption too, because I love pastors, and I believe we are some of the best, godliest people of integrity in the world. But let's face it, folks, we've all read the news recently, and we know that that cannot be assumed anymore. For 40 years, we've taught pastors technical excellence. Technical excellence was our competence. What if for the next 40 years, we taught integrity as the new competence? Let's not assume it anymore, because we can't. Let's teach it. Let's live it. Let's make sure that we're living it out in our own lives. See, here's the deal. We've got a real concern and a genuine concern for people who are leaving the church. They use terms like deconstructing and ex-evangelical. And when I first heard those terms, I thought it was just fancy names for backsliding. Sometimes it is, but most of the time it's not. If you've got someone in your life who is using one of those terms or others, ex-evangelical, deconstructing, and so on, they are actively doing something. They're not just being lazy. They are actively questioning what they've seen in the church, what they've heard in the church, what they've received from the church, and what's missing from what they've received in the church. Now, and here's the deal. Nobody is leaving because of a lack of technical excellence. Nobody, you will not find a single person who calls themselves ex-evangelical because the band couldn't keep in tune.
Heard that?
Right? You will find them leaving because of a lack of integrity. Sometimes it's a lack of their own integrity, but often it's a lack of our integrity. We can't get them back by technical excellence because they didn't leave because of a lack of technical excellence. Our technical excellence is as good as it's ever been, and they're still leaving. We're not going to get them back with cooler videos. They're leaving because of a lack of integrity, and only restoring that integrity is going to bring them back. So how do we restore integrity after it's been lost? How do we restore trust after it's been lost? This is the only way I know. To every church leader, let me say this. You got to do the right thing. You got to do the right thing every time. You've got to do it for a long time. And you've got to do it with no agenda. Do the right thing every time for a long time with no agenda. This is what the world is hungry for. And if they see it in us, this will be what will be attractive to them. Here's the deal. They're not coming to our churches because of your sermon. They can get a better one on their phone without getting out of bed. But if we will be people of integrity again, and if we will be a part of relationships with them and showing them that we are people of integrity, that is what will draw them back to Jesus and to the church again. We've spent too much time obsessing over performance and numbers. It's time for us to take a look at discipleship and being people of integrity again. Amen? Amen. Thank you.